14th, 1940, the German army is continuing its advance through Sedan in an effort to cut off and surround the Allied armies in Belgium. The French General Staff, realizing they have been outmaneuvered, counterattack with one of the few armored divisions in the French army. It is a last desperate attempt to halt the German tanks of General Guderian. Stretched out over 12 miles, it's massacred, company by company. Between the 16th and 19th of May, another armoured division, the 4th, is hurriedly assembled and with Colonel de Gaulle in command, is thrown into the battle at Montcornet. For 24 hours, Guderian's armour is held in check. But once again, the Stukas appear in the clear blue sky. The Stukas, with their terrifying sirens. The French counterattack has advanced 1 mile towards Guderian's command post, but the Stukas stop them dead in their tracks. In spite of the odds, they fight valiantly. Also, they have discovered that in a battle of tank versus tank, the French armour is superior to the German. But they had neither anti-aircraft weapons nor air cover. Inevitably, they are defeated. Guderian and his tanks break through. Then General von Kleist orders him to stop and wait for the rest of the army. He ignores the order. Alone, he pushes on towards the Channel. General Beaufray was a captain on the French General Staff at the time.
Un officier d'état-major.
A general staff officer who was running a shuttle service between the groups of the army in the north had passed by as the German advance guard was going forward, and he had watched from behind the hedge. He reckoned there were only 10 motorcyclists and an armored car, a small advance guard.
Franchement rien, quoi, une petite avant-garde.
This advance guard was going forward, and some of the defenders shouted, "Here come the Germans, here come the Germans, the Germans!" And everyone ran out of camp. This was the equivalent of what we had seen in earlier years. Here come the Russians, and here come the Cossacks. There was a sort of panic which preceded the arrival of the Germans, which meant that in reality there was no resistance between Sedan and the sea.
On the French coast, there is total confusion with the arrival of the Germans. The units, cut off from headquarters, are dislocated. Refugees from Belgium and northern France crowd the roads with their meager belongings. The regiments circle aimlessly. Where can they go next? The Germans are everywhere, in front and behind, north and south.
Nous avions le supplice de la goutte d'eau. Nous avions.
We were given a sort of water torture. We received bad news, bad news, bad news, unceasing bad news, without having the least success. If only the staff officers at General Georges' headquarters, who took notes to report, you know, had finished by becoming a little, how can I say, impressed by this atmosphere. Instead, they sneered and said to each other, "Oh yes, you are pushed back. Good, I'll make a note of it." It was an incredible atmosphere. This sort of moral wear and tear, which was produced by the accumulation of 8 days of constantly bad news, had in some ways worn away, worn to the bone, the capacity for reaction.
Helplessly, the French generals watched the collapse of their defense plans.
Le 18, peut-être le 17. Doumerc m'a dit...
Perhaps the 18th or the 19th, General Doumerc said to me, "This can't go on. I'm going to look for Gamelin." Because General Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, wasn't near the front. He was at Vincennes, rear headquarters. Doumerc left in a car to look for Gamelin, whom he regarded as a professional soldier, if one can say that. And then he spoke with him in the car, saying, "General, orders must be given. We can't stay down there." Then Gamelin came down, very dignified, with his little pot belly, and in that same room at Bourdon, he said, "Well, I will give you an order."
Je vais vous donner une directive. Cette directive commençait par...
This order began with an extraordinary sentence, which was, "Without wishing to become involved in the conduct of the battle, it is acknowledged that special orders must be given to take account of the movement involving our left wing."
De notre aile gauche. En conséquence,
In consequence, the Northern Army Group will march towards the north.
le groupe d'armée de l'Ouest, qui était le GA3, marchera vers le nord. Voilà. Et puis, là-dessus...
That's it. And then, right there and then, he went into lunch.
Il y avait au Bourdon une belle salle à manger.
There was a beautiful dining room in the Bourdon. It's quite a ridiculous memory, but I believe it's worth recalling.
C'est ridicule, mais je crois qu'il vaut la peine d'être rappelé. Le général Gamelin...
You see, General Gamelin had in some way excited the patriotic zeal of the cook, who had produced a lunch which was almost a wedding feast.
Et le cuisinier avait fait un déjeuner qui était à peu près l'équivalent d'un repas de noces. Et ce repas de noces...
And this incredible banquet took place in a deathly atmosphere. It was almost that. And Gamelin was swaggering and making jokes. Not particularly good ones, no, but he was talking, and that rang false, entirely false.
Et ça sonnait faux, mais entièrement faux. À la fin de ce banquet...
At the end of this banquet, at the same time sad and comique, an enormous set piece arrived with angel's food cake.
Et j'avoue que
And I swear that this arrival seemed to me so out of place that I felt sorry the floor didn't open and swallow the table.
Sur cette tablée,
Gamelin had a large helping of the set piece, and then we saluted him, and he left. And that was the end of his military career.
Et ça a été la fin de sa carrière militaire.
Weygand, 72 years old, replaces Gamelin. He was the head of Foch's General Staff during the First World War. Reynaud also makes Marshal Pétain Vice President of the Council. Pétain, who won the Battle of Verdun in the First World War, is already forming a separate political group. Meanwhile, Guderian pursues his race to the sea. He advances 60 miles a day. On the 19th, he is at St. Quentin. On the 20th, he takes Amiens, then Abbeville. On the evening of the 20th, the Spitta battalion of the 2nd Panzer Division is the first to reach the Channel coast. The loop is closed. The Allied Army of the North is surrounded. The Belgian Army, the British Expeditionary Corps, and 2 French armies. It's still a considerable force. Weygand himself gives the order to attack from north to south, to break out. This was Weygand's first plan. But the British don't have faith in him anymore. Lord Gort, the British Commander-in-Chief, has only one concern: to save his Expeditionary Corps. On May the 25th, the British divisions, surrounded at Arras, received the order to retreat to Dunkirk. without informing the French. As for the Belgians, they capitulated unconditionally 2 days later. King Leopold took this decision against the advice of his government and only warned the French an hour later. He refused to leave for London. For the nations, as for the men, it's a disaster. Most of the French army in the north, surrounded and in disorder, falls into German hands, entire divisions, together with their generals. General Giraud, commander of the 9th Army, is taken prisoner. Hitler comes to visit the front, to congratulate his troops. At Ypres, where as a corporal he had fought in World War I, he gives the order for his armored divisions to halt. Will he now threaten England? Will he leave Göring's Luftwaffe to kill off the wounded enemy? Or is he still afraid of an Allied counterattack along the length of his flank? In any case, the German troops take a breather for the first time in 10 days after a 250-mile advance, while the encircled Allied armies fall back on Dunkirk. The entire British Expeditionary Force and the remains of the Army of the North are now holed up in Dunkirk, in a tight mass, hemmed in on all sides. Churchill, who has replaced Chamberlain as head of the British government, gives the order to save the British Expeditionary Corps, the only army Britain possesses. "850 boats of all kinds cross the English Channel. Fishing boats, lifeboats, coastal freighters, pleasure yachts, trawlers, tugs, and even the ceremonial barges from the Thames. Anything that can stay afloat sails for France, and soon 300 French boats join them. In the pocket of Dunkirk, 500,000 men are waiting for them. 500,000 men, exhausted, beaten, and lost, who have gathered on the beaches. 300,000 British, 200,000 French. The Luftwaffe constantly attacks the boats. More than 6,000 men died in the evacuation, burned, drowned, or choked by fuel oil from damaged and sunken ships. So, Dunkirk becomes a great battle for the French Navy, the Royal Navy, and the Royal Air Force, who throw in 150 fighter planes. They lose 106, but they account for 150 German planes. All around the beaches of Dunkirk, the Germans attack furiously. They realize now that the enemy is going to escape them, and 3 French divisions fight at close quarters to hold them off for nearly a week. The soldiers of the 12th, 32nd, and 68th Divisions are sacrificed to protect the embarkation. In 8 days, the English and French boats evacuate 330,000 men back to England. 200,000 British soldiers have escaped from the Germans. This is a success, but it isn't victory. On the contrary, for the first time, the British realize that they themselves can be invaded. It's a shock. On June the 4th, in a great debate in the House of Commons, Churchill announces solemnly that if necessary, England will fight to the end, on the beaches, on the hills, in the fields, and in the streets. On that day, the spirit of Dunkirk is born. "130,000 French now find themselves in England. For them, the Battle of France has not ended. French boats are going to take them back to Brittany to carry on the fight. June the 4th, the Germans enter Dunkirk and discover all the equipment abandoned by the British. 2,500 heavy guns, 11,000 machine guns, and 75,000 vehicles. Off the beach lie the wrecks of 243 sunken boats, of which 9 were British destroyers and 6 French torpedo boats. "90,000 soldiers who haven't been able to embark are taken prisoner. 50,000 British and 40,000 French. Dunkirk is a bitter defeat. General Weygand has lost his battle force. To create a new army, Weygand recalls the Alpine troops from the Maginot Line and from North Africa. He hopes to constitute a new force of 60 divisions in order to counterattack. But for that, he needs time, 15 days. Meanwhile, he gives the order to hold the Somme. This is the Weygand line. For this holding mission on the Somme, he has only 7 divisions. Among them, the 4th Armoured Division under Colonel de Gaulle. De Gaulle is given the temporary rank of general. They arrive in the Abbeville sector. One of his officers, Lieutenant Cressman, remembers.
This is where General de Gaulle was. His command post, his room was here, below to the right. And when we came for liaison meetings, all that courtyard was cluttered by general staff equipment. And when we came for briefing, we came through that door and we went in to find General de Gaulle in his office there. We were in the middle of enormous confusion. Everything was upside down. We saw only men who were fleeing the scene with all their belongings, their wagons, their cows, their horses, their old carriages. And the troops were quitting too. Truly, one didn't know who would be able to hold out. Well, de Gaulle held out for a long time.
Not only does de Gaulle hold out, but he attacks as he had always advocated, with all the tanks massed like a clenched fist. He advances 15 kilometers.
This wood was taken, and then the one behind. One more victory, and we would be heading for Berlin.
And just when did you feel that things were turning out badly?
Listen, we didn't have that feeling that things were going badly. One felt that we were running out of steam. We hadn't any more tanks or equipment left, and that one couldn't advance any further because we were alone. Reinforcements were needed, but we were never desperate at any time. We took very hard blows there. Down below, there is the village of Maroy, which was retaken. We retook it, they took it back. We went back as far as the end of the village there. There were battles, but we were always winning until the moment when we were told, good, retreat, you are being relieved. And we were reunited then in a forsaken place called WWII. And it's there de Gaulle held his first parade. It was the 2nd of June. I shall remember it all my life. It was my wedding anniversary. And it was the first time de Gaulle had been seen reviewing his troops, those that were left. Then we were a little proud. One threw one's chest out to perhaps receive medals. We were there in ranks, the last of the Mohicans, bold as brass. And he arrived, our general. He spoke to all these proud men, one after the other, and he said to each one, where is your tank? It is burnt, my general. How did it get burnt? I was hit twice by the 105s. But it should have been extinguished. I extinguished it, my general, but they hit me again. Well, it should have been salvaged a second time. I've no use for men without equipment. I'd rather have equipment without men. That was the goal.
June the 5th. Paul Reynaud gets rid of Daladier, and he calls in General de Gaulle as Under-Secretary for War. He wants to stiffen his cabinet because Marshal Pétain and several other ministers are already talking about ending the war. In less than 48 hours, the Germans have overwhelmed the Weygand line and crossed the Somme. It is a tidal wave. 95 German divisions, 10 of which are armored, fan out over France. In 2 days, Rommel conquers Normandy and takes Rouen. At the same time, von Kleist's armored divisions are approaching Paris. The Parisians, in their turn, are panic-stricken. Everything collapses. On June the 10th, the government leaves Paris. The same day, Mussolini declares war on France. A stab in the back. The French people feel abandoned. They flee, leaving everything, their houses, their towns, their villages. It is a terrible exodus, but impossible to escape attack from the plains, which spray the roads thronged with soldiers and refugees with machine gun fire. People ask, where is the French Air Force? What are they doing? The French planes are fighting, but away up there, at an altitude of 15 or 20,000 feet, where no one sees them. One of their pilots, Captain Accard, is a leading ace. He has destroyed 16 German planes, He can testify that the sky wasn't empty.
It is a reproach I have often heard, and in my hospital bed at Grange Blanche, I could see around me people who were completely surprised that an airman had been around to be shot down.
Pour les Français, tout ce qui volait était ennemi.
For the French, everything that flew was an enemy. One of my comrades, Captain Portalis, was hit above Moselle. He came down by parachute in the middle of some French troops who shot him. He had shouted to them that he was French. They shot him, even though he had a bullet in his leg. That's how it was. Anything in the air was Canadian or German or British, never French.
Meanwhile, nearly 1,000 French fighters are making a stand against the Luftwaffe in an unequal contest, 1 against 3. 400 bombers and reconnaissance planes, obsolete machines, are massacred in the first days of the offensive. But the French fighters bring down almost 1,000 German planes. The cost is high, 700 planes lost and 200 pilots killed. Captain Accard himself was brought down in a dogfight.
I had disengaged to come back, to take up the attack again on the German bomber formation, when I was shot between the eyes. I lost consciousness, and then I woke up without really knowing what had happened to me. I couldn't see sky or earth or my instruments. I had jumped, but with the speed that I fell, my arms twisted around, and then with difficulty, after counting up to 10, I opened my parachute. I was falling very fast and was afraid it would tear. And in the midst of this, I remembered that between 5 and 6, I was looking for the parachute cord. And the next thing I knew, I'd landed in the bushes, which had broken my fall because the parachute had been damaged in spite of everything. The brave man who picked me up wrote later, we found the corpse of that officer in the bushes.
Did they manage to get the bullet out?
No, it's still there.
June the 11th. Complete collapse. Churchill comes to the Mouguet Chateau, close to Briare on the Loire, to meet the French government, who are moving from chateau to chateau. The atmosphere is depressed. General Weygand and Marshal Pétain paint a dark picture of the situation. The fight must be stopped, they say. That's the government's business, Paul Reynaud cuts in curtly and turns to Churchill. We haven't any more planes, he says. Send us all the RAF planes. Impossible, replies Churchill. We shall need them to defend England soon. Suggestions fall on deaf ears. Anthony Eden, then British Minister for War, is the only witness to the meeting still alive. In 1973, he was filmed by a French camera crew.
We had spoken for almost 3 hours without really getting anywhere, because we had already supplied all we had. It was explained that the British Army and the Air Force had been sent, and there was nothing more to send. And at the end, I remember, Churchill said what was going to happen if the need arose. He said, we are going to continue the war alone. You won't have any regrets, naturally, but that is what we want to do. And I remember slightly the faces of the 3 men opposite me. There was, at that moment, there were 4, because General George had arrived during the discussion. But the 3 principals were there. Reynaud, who was inscrutable. Weygand was listening politely, but I believed was unconvinced. And then Pétain, who had an incredulous expression.
During dinner, Anthony Eden received confirmation of the division between the French.
At the moment when we were going to sit down, a tall chap came in, and it was de Gaulle.
C'était de Gaulle. Et Weygand lui a dit,
And Weygand said, turning towards him, perhaps you'd like to sit next to me. Weygand was answered by de Gaulle in a dry voice, I have instructions to sit next to the British Prime Minister.
de m'asseoir auprès du Premier ministre britannique.
I thought that Weygand was not very happy about his answer.
Pétain a parlé,
Pétain spoke above all about the destruction of the French towns. Naturally, I was most sympathetic about that, but he insisted, I think, that it was not only Abbeville and Amiens, but that other towns had been destroyed as well. And then I said to him, well, Monsieur le Maréchal, all that's true, but there's something worse than the destruction of towns. He replied, that's typical of the English, because you've never seen anything like it in your country. I replied, well, perhaps we shall this time.
The next day, Churchill and Eden prepare to leave for London, convinced that Marshal Pétain has decided to abandon the fight.
le matin prochain.
The next morning, when we were on the steps of the house, Churchill and I, Reynaud came to speak to us about his difficulties with Pétain.
À ce moment-là, Pétain s'approchait.
At that moment, Pétain came up the steps, and Reynaud said to us, I remember it well, he's looking well this morning. There must have been disastrous news.
June the 14th, at dawn, the Germans enter Paris. Paris, an open city. Empty Paris. At the head of the column was Feldwebel Max Buschenhofen.
Notre entrée
Our entry into Paris was on June the 14th, 1940, by the St. Ouen Gate. We had followed the outside roads and the Wagram Avenue as far as the Arc de Triomphe.
And what were the reactions of the Parisians?
il n'y a pas eu
There wasn't any. There weren't many people in the streets. There were some people who made friendly signs to us. Others turned their backs. Most of the Parisians were behind the shutters of their windows.
se trouvèrent derrière les rideaux de leurs fenêtres.
50 yards from here, the great French surgeon, Professor Martel, shot himself through the head. Feldwebel Max Buschenhofen still doesn't believe he's here at the foot of the Arc de Triomphe. From the top of the Eiffel Tower, they contemplate Paris at their feet. Paris under the jackboot.
Le centre d'anti-victoire.
Generaloberst von Bock und General der Artillerie von Küchler nehmen im Vorbeimarsch ihre Truppen ab.
German newsreels proudly proclaim the occupation of Paris to the German people.
Place de la Concorde. Im Hintergrund rechts das Marineministerium. Der Invalidendom, in dem Napoleon I. beigesetzt ist. Paris ist in deutscher Hand.
Yes, Paris is in the hands of the Germans. After the assault troops, smart, fresh and happy, marched down the Champs-Élysées, the SS arrived and the Gestapo, who will install themselves the next day in the Avenue Foch. Parisians are on the roads, but they haven't gone very far. They no longer know where to go. All the bridges over the Loire are blown up. Then, hungry, bruised and desperate, they lie down in the ditches. And they watch the passage of the conquerors, these young soldiers, big and blonde with open collars, and always the noise of boots. The Gien Bridge, still in existence. A human tide of refugees crowds over, thrown into disorder by the bombings of the Stukas. On the other side, Claude Bélanger and a group of French soldiers have a tightness in their throats. They have received the order to blow up the bridge.
We began to imagine the Germans so close that it would be necessary to blow up the bridge. And it was still crowded with terrified refugees. And finally, in this frantic crowd, the extraordinary sounds and cries nearly made one forget that without further hesitation, the bridge had to be blown up. Two young girls jumped into the water in the vain hope of crossing, and they drowned one after the other. One saw women go completely mad, who wanted to destroy themselves, to commit suicide, and who even attempted to kill the people around them. There was one case of a poor woman who had a baby in her arms and who smashed her baby's head against the parapet. These were dreadful incidents which couldn't be thought about.
He will remember it all his life, that citizen of Gien, Monsieur Pilat, the Loire filled with the drifting bodies of the refugees. The Loire, last line of defense, where certain units put up a last hopeless fight. Like the officer cadets of the Cavalry College at Saumur, Officer Cadet Crestaille was one. Why did you fight here?
Because we were ordered to.
Whose order?
Colonel Michon, who was the commandant of the college, and a man who is worth describing. He made us visit, one after another, the college museum, where there was a collection of outstanding exhibits, and at the end of this visit he told us that when we received our commission from the college, we would probably be posted to some of the units given suicide missions.
And you accepted this?
Absolutely. I know that in that generation of boys between 18 and 22, the question didn't even arise.
There are 800 Saumur cadets. They lack artillery and air cover, but they halt the German armored divisions along a 24-mile front. Francois de la Grange was also an officer cadet. Did you think you were going to die?
I don't know if one even asked that question. Yes, perhaps. Certainly. What one wanted, I believe, was above all to save one's honor.
And you don't believe that this sacrifice of the Saumur cadets was useless?
Useless? I don't know in the long run. Useless in the plan of the strategy of the war, certainly. Besides, the mayor had ordered Colonel Michon to declare Saumur an open town, saying that it was absolutely foolish to have the town shelled by German artillery, since the fight was hopeless and wouldn't, strictly speaking, serve any purpose. We had slowed down the enemy. We had slowed them down by 3 days, 4 days, with practically no proper equipment. That is perhaps an exploit on the technical level, if I dare say so. But in all ways, I believe that the sacrifice of my comrades who died was not useless, simply because we had certain beliefs about France. And I think that those who survived this battle, and their children, will have in the end preserved this ideal of France.
The French army is no more. 1,450,000 men have been taken prisoner. 100,000 have been killed, 250,000 wounded. Yes, the French are beaten. In 1 month, they have lost relatively more men than in the worst moments of the First World War. They deserve better than that. In Bordeaux, the French government, the deputies and the ministers camp in the town hall, in the police station, in the hotel. In the port, the steamer Massilia is standing by, ready to carry them to North Africa if necessary. But for 4 days, 2 factions stand against each other. Pétain and Weygand, with Laval in the shadows, demand an armistice. Reynaud, Mandel and de Gaulle want France to carry on the fight in North Africa alongside the British. On June the 15th, there is a dramatic meeting of the Council of Ministers. Monsieur Pierre de Lys, Weygand's aide-de-camp, was there.
Monsieur
Paul Reynaud proposed to General Weygand that he should capitulate. And General Weygand, I still remember, was violently angry and sweating. He was beside himself, saying, "What? You are asking me to capitulate? I will never capitulate. The capitulation of an army at war is a disgrace to that army." In the eyes of a soldier, there is an essential difference, I believe, between the capitulation of an army that has been beaten and one which is still armed. That is to say, if there are no more arms, the enemy comes in, invading the land, and there is nothing more opposing him. In an armistice, it is the government who takes the responsibility, not to disarm, but to cease hostilities on certain conditions.
The next day, Reynaud gives way and resigns. De Gaulle leaves for London. Pétain becomes the head of government.
Frenchmen, I make the gift of myself to France to mitigate her misfortune. It is with a broken heart that I tell you today that the fight must cease.
Hitler dictates his conditions. The armistice will be signed at Bretonde in the Compiègne forest, where that other armistice had been signed on November the 11th, 1918. At 3:15, Hitler arrives, accompanied by Marshal Göring, Grand Admiral Roeder, General Keitel, Ribbentrop, Hess, and Himmler. They are all there. There's the historic carriage, Fox carriage. At 3:30, the French parliamentarians arrive. General Hunziger, Air Marshal Bergeret, Admiral Laluc, and the ambassador Léon Noël. They have come from Paris and are surprised. The Germans hadn't told them where they were being taken. Immediately, without saying a word, Hitler signals to General Keitel, who reads a preliminary declaration. The French delegation has been brought here to wipe out the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles and to make good the injustice done to the German people. At 3:40 in the afternoon, Hitler sets out the text of the conditions of the armistice to the French. Then he gets up and goes. he hasn't said a word. In fact, he is very pleased to declare an armistice with France. 2 days earlier, he had explained to Mussolini, who would have preferred to deal with a legal French government, that it would be easier to carry out German decisions through the French civil service. Although Hitler appears to be conciliatory, it's only to further his own interests. France is divided into 2 zones, an occupied zone in the north and a free zone in the south. Hitler doesn't take over the French fleet. He simply requires that it is disarmed in French ports. At 5:45, the French realize the full extent of Hitler's dictatorship. One clause is unacceptable. Hitler requires France to send him the German citizens who took refuge in France, the Jews and the anti-Nazis. From the tents set up for them, the French delegates telephone Bordeaux. Then they argue with the Germans for 24 hours. The next day, General Keitel gives them an ultimatum. You have 1 hour to sign. Pétain's government backs down. On June the 22nd at 6:50 p.m., the armistice is signed. The German refugees are betrayed to Hitler. In London, General de Gaulle says no to the armistice, no to defeat. No, France hasn't lost the war. She has only lost a battle.
The French defeat was due to the mechanized air and ground forces of the enemy. We believe that for the honor of France, we must continue to make war alongside our allies. A superior mechanized force will allow us to achieve victory and to deliver our country.
Paris, June the 23rd. All night, the French prisoners of war have been working to remove the sandbags which cover the monuments of the capital. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Paris receives a distinguished tourist, Adolf Hitler. Paris is occupied. But this isn't the end of the tragic story. All is ready for the second act. The collaborators, the Gestapo, the hunger and the misery. Also the resistance, torture. Europe is all set for 4 years of anguish.